Welcome back. You're here with Goldberg. As you know, in the past, I've talked about how genuine working class or populist movements in the United States are swiftly co-opted by big money or establishment interests. In the case of the right, you'd see the Tea Party. So it was a bunch of folks concerned about out-of-control government spending and the taxes imposed on them. And by the end, as we know, it was Grover Norquist's pet project. We've got to preserve the tax breaks for the richest Americans. Not even corporations, but the richest Americans, or the economy is going to collapse into horrible socialism. With the progressive left, it's interesting. They actually parrot what is a fundamentally neoliberal and globalist talking point, despite the fact they claim to believe in economic justice and the workers. And this particular saying, which goes, well, immigrants work harder than Americans. I want to say it was birthed in the Reagan era, but certainly in the 90s, Billy Boy Clinton, the Democratic Party, once it had really jettisoned any sense of the common man, they started pushing it as well. And people don't seem to realize that it's not based upon any sound logic or statistics. There's no reasoning behind it. Well, you actually get to that point later on, and I'll discuss. But how do you quantify that? It's as though these people, typically white progressives, think that if you have a funky accent or you come from a different country, that you have a stronger work ethic. And it's frankly kind of a low-key racism, because what they're saying is immigrants work harder than whites and blacks. Now, if they're going to be that specific, they'll say whites. They won't say blacks. I would love, of course, to hear one of these neoliberal advocates write an article with the headline, immigrants work harder than black Americans. I'd love to see the response to that. I'd love to see how long they would keep their job. But yeah, we see no actual, solid argument in favor of this concept, except for the fact that it's convenient if you tend to be a multinational and you want to displace American workers. So I thought we would start at the top, which would be, legal migration, the visa program, U.S. tech workers, which I will link to that whole Twitter account. They've got phenomenal information on this particular subject. And progressives, you should know this. Donald Trump, besides his, I'm against illegal immigration, Donald Trump is a huge advocate of mass immigration on the legal level. And Democrats as well, Democrats like Mark Warner, Barack the Booty Obama, back when you had that Gang of Eight Cucks legislation, a lot of what they wanted to do was just open the floodgates when it came to the visa programs. And Trump wants to do the exact same thing, despite claiming that he wants to reduce immigration. Why are they in favor of that? Well, because it's an easy approach to undercutting domestic graduates, American students who go to universities, who might demand higher salaries. So they want to bring in cheaper labor in order to benefit their corporate donors. So, despite the claim that these folks work harder, whether you want to say, from China, Indian subcontinent, whatnot, there's not much data to support that. In fact, if you speak with folks who work in IT, or you work in IT yourself, you may have well experienced this, they're not particularly good at coding. I'm sure there are some, but a lot of stories of them screwing up coding, then we have to bring in Americans to solve the problems. And I have no hatred towards these people individually. I'm not trying to badmouth them, just saying. The claim that they are harder workers, they do better jobs, it's totally unsupported by reality. And then, of course, when they start getting into hiring roles, they tend to be extraordinarily ethnocentric, even though, and if you see when they respond to those who don't want massive expansions of the visa program, like the legislation proposed by Mike Lee, and also some Democrats, they'll call you a racist for opposing expansion of the visa program, even though they tend to be ethnocentric when it comes to hiring if they happen to be in that position at some point. So, like I was discussing in the video on, you being paid according to your value as opposed to what they decide you're worth, well, think about it for a second. You, as an American graduate, maybe you didn't have all your student loans paid off, and school is very expensive in the United States. Now you've got to figure out a way to compete with these folks who will take a lot less money and may not necessarily have any debt themselves, so you don't have the best position to negotiate from. So you've got to try to get extra certs or just prove yourself that much better. So what we're doing as a country is we expect people to make sacrifices to get education, but then we're screwing them over when it comes to the job market. and you're supposed to shut up and sit down or you're a racist, essentially. Then you get into like lower wage professions, and I want to say this from the get-go. I've worked agricultural, I've worked retail, I've worked trades, now I work in IT, and so I'm not just speaking, from no experience here. But thinking of like retail as an example, the immigrants work harder. I can't say that unreservedly. I mean, there are some certainly. Like, I'm not the type of person, I don't judge people based upon the fact that they have an accent or the fact that they have a particular religion. It's like work ethic is something that you either learn from your family or maybe you learn on the job. It's not based upon a particular background specifically. And so, did you have immigrants working who were hardworking? Yes, absolutely. Did you have some that were the laziest pieces of whatever you can possibly imagine? Yes. I mean, if we take this progressive neoliberal talking point, it's like laziness does not exist outside of the United States. Think of how stupid that sounds, all right? So to give you a few examples, I had a coworker, she was from Afghanistan, wonderful lady, very hardworking. I had another coworker, a lady from Pakistan, lazy as hell. She would sit there complaining that in Pakistan, she didn't have to work. Another guy from Pakistan who would constantly take breaks because he had to, I guess, pray towards Mecca. I worked with folks from various African countries. Again, some of them great work ethic. Others, no sense of showing up on time whatsoever. Or if they were supposed to take a break for 15, 30 minutes, they'd come back in like an hour, hour and a half. And if they got written up for it, they were the first to claim racism. All right. I worked with folks from Central America. Again, some of them extremely hardworking. Others don't really have a sense of work ethic. It's not based upon where you come from. And like I said, there's going to be lazy Americans, there's going to be harder working Americans. So trying to make a claim that immigrants are harder working based upon nothing at all is a little bit suspect, and we'll get into that just a little bit here. Let's talk about illegal migration for a second, and illegal immigrant labor. There's an excellent book, and I highly advise checking it out regardless of where you stand, called The Chain, and it's discussing Hormel Foods and the meat production industry. Well, a lot of the story, it kind of goes back and forth, but a lot of the book revolves around Fremont, Nebraska, I think it was. And they had this fight where they wanted to do an ordinance against illegal migration, or really against illegal immigrant labor at the end of the day. Well, of course, big uproar, and at the end, the factory itself got itself to be rezoned outside of the city limits, so it didn't apply to them. Typical corporate behavior. Well, what happened is Hormel went through, I think, the early 1900s, a typical labor union upheaval. They came to the table, they decided to give better benefits pay, and that worked for a long time. Well, the guy in charge, he passes on. New wave of managers, they say, well, we're not going to do this. We want to cut pay and benefits by like 23%. Obviously, a lot of workers were kind of upset because that was their livelihood. That's what they had invested in. They were demonstrating they wanted some self-respect. Well, what the owners did to get around the fact that you had a union, or at least people with union attitudes, they went and started hiring illegal immigrants. And at one point he says, the Hispanics work harder than the whites. But then they actually admit what they meant by working harder is the Hispanic illegal immigrants would take less pay and less benefits. Yes, folks, this is what it means. When someone says immigrants work harder than Americans, it doesn't mean that immigrants have more work ethic. It doesn't mean that Americans are lazy. It means we can pay these people less because they have no choice. This is something, by the way, that's like it's a tapestry of American economic history when it relates to the managers, the executives versus the workers. Whenever a group of workers starts standing up and demanding more rights, they find a way to undercut them. So part of that was importing Chinese labor for the railroads, which they could treat them like garbage and pay them less. And then, of course, when the labor union movement really picked up, they said, okay, well, we'll take advantage of the fact that a lot of black Americans are disenfranchised, and we'll try to pay them less and undercut the unions. And then once black people started saying, we're not going to take it anymore, it was like, well, then we can go south of the border and get the illegal immigrant labor. That is the truth. This whole statement, which is immensely racist, as I said, is not about the fact that they have higher work ethic. It's about the fact you can try to pay them less. You can undercut working class Americans, middle class Americans, And then you can dress it up as, well, you're just scared of them, you're xenophobic, you're racist, you don't want to compete, you're insecure. These are all the statements of the globalist neoliberals. And so if you're foolish enough as a progressive to go along with it, you need to get your head out of the sand, because you are selling your fellow American workers and folks in the middle class down the river just so that you can say, I'm not a racist. That's a pretty stupid cause, if you ask me.